I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. Thank you for joining us for this introductory lesson on state open meeting laws. This class will feature a local journalist sharing stories of government bodies inappropriately holding executive sessions. These are secret meetings that are allowed only under certain circumstances. You'll hear how these meetings occurred and how they affect the public's right to know. If you haven't already, please view our previous lessons on open meetings, state public record laws, and the Federal Freedom of Information Act. They can all be found on our YouTube channel as well as in our FOI guide at NEFAC.org. Before we begin this lesson, a special thanks to those helping us make these classes happen: the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, SPJ New England, the Rhode Island Foundation, MuckRock, and the New England Society of News Editors. We appreciate everyone's support. Now, to introduce you to today's instructor, NEFAC's Emily Sweeney.
Hey everybody, I'm Emily Sweeney from the Boston Globe, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this webinar, which is part of our ongoing series on state open meeting laws. And with us is Len Besthoff, the Chief Investigative Reporter for the NBC Connecticut Investigates team, who's going to explain how he's covered these kinds of secret meetings. Len, thank you so much for being with us today and leading us on this session.
Well, thank you so much for having us. We are just flattered that you would ask for us to contribute to this and hopefully help further the knowledge for some folks about what is a tricky part of covering meetings. This is a situation where I'm just going to go backwards a little bit. And in case anybody isn't familiar with executive sessions is when a board or an agency is holding a meeting and they need to discuss something in private. And there are reasons for that. There are good reasons. If it's medical, if let's say they're talking about a contract and somebody's made a bid and there may be proprietary information or a proprietary bid that, if that was given out in public could hurt that company. Certainly you don't want that. And certainly you don't want personally identifiable information or medical information with HIPAA and everything else getting put out into the public domain. So those kind of things we understand when it comes to executive sessions. And the other thing with executive sessions, at least in Connecticut, is it has to be during a regular meeting. It can't just be an executive session that's called just for that. And in an executives or in a meeting, they have to say, okay, we are going to go into executive session, and they have to say generally what the topic is that they're going to talk about. And then they go into executive session. They must come back out of executive session and then address the public again and say, okay, we had this executive session and we discussed this and we voted X or we did this. And again, speaking in broad terms, but there has to be some transparency about an executive session, even though it can't be totally transparent. And this is sort of what we ran into a few years ago here, but there is a bit of a backstory I need to give first. So what we're talking about is the Blue Hills Fire District, which is in a small town just north of Hartford called Bloomfield. And the Blue Hills Fire District covers about half of a town of 25,000 people. So it's on the smaller side. It has 3 commissioners who are in charge of the district and do all the voting. And we can get into that a little more at another point here, talking about the size of that commission. But we began covering them in 2016. We got a tip from an insider who said, you cannot believe all of the benefits, bonuses that these 3 commissioners are getting. And we were quite surprised. I mean, look, it is somewhat it's somewhat common that if you have a commissioner, they may get a stipend for their service. Might be $1,000 for the year, but not the case here with the Blue Hills Fire District. They got a $5,000 annual stipend, up to a $6,000 annual performance bonus, $2,000 roughly holiday bonus. So now we're up 6,000. That's what, 13,000 right there. 6,500, yeah, 13,000. Then they got 20 gallons of free gas per week. just from the fire district, because they were conducting fire business, supposedly. And they got fire department credit cards that were not very closely monitored. So we did a big story called Commissioners with Benefits in 2016. It was well received. And one of the other things we found out that was very shocking when we did this story, and this gets to our bigger point about executive sessions, is that it's hard to believe this one, but the Blue Hills Fire District, this was before we started the coverage in 2016, but around that time, maybe 2016, 2015, they held an executive session at a restaurant. Nobody else there, just the commissioners. There was no commission meeting before, there was no meeting after. The public was never told, we had a meeting and we talked about this, and we brought that up certainly as well. They defended it, but said they could do better. They hoped to do better eventually. I guess the outcome of our story was essentially that we started to get some movement in the town. But before I get in all that, I want to talk about just what we noticed was that there was a constant of these sunshine law failures. Like I told you about, there was this executive session that literally was held at a restaurant, the Chowder Pot 4, right along I-91 in the Hartford area. And they have great biscuits, I will tell you, and fantastic seafood, but you shouldn't be holding executive sessions. And they said, well, we invited the public and let them know. There were some questions about how good that notice was. So all this coverage led to change. Some of the things that we did see were very prominent, but the other constant were these sunshine law failures. And so we got all kinds of tips about meetings with proper notice, and we started noticing them. Either there was not timely notice, or it was at a very strange time of the day. Sometimes they didn't put in what they were having a meeting about, or they would miscategorize a meeting that might be emergency or special. There's different timelines you have to do for those in terms of when you have to announce it, put public notice in a newspaper, put a sign out in front of the fire district. This got so bad, and because they were trying to do these meetings in some cases with less than a day's notice on very key issues, that we started telling the commission, we're going to file a complaint against you because this is not proper notice. And in some cases, they had to cancel meetings, more than one, at least two. I believe that in some cases, we brought these complaints to the FOI commission. I can't remember if they were formal complaints or just verbal or email, but they did have to get training twice, just to understand what, Robert's Rules of Law, other things with executive session in terms of proper notice. And it was hard to tell if they were really getting that or not, but the public was. And when we kept doing these stories, there were a bunch of them, there was, a lot of response from the public. In addition to some of the outrage about these sunshine law violations, there was also change that did happen. For example, I'm trying to look this up here. I have some notes. They did vote out one of the commissioners. They also, disband, or they set up a bylaw committee, because what we found out when we were doing these stories is they had no bylaws. And so they could do whatever they wanted because there was nothing governing what they were doing. And so they set up this bylaw committee. We actually covered it a few times. And that's when things started to get interesting. And that's what sort of brings us to this executive session. While all this was going on, like I said, one commissioner got voted out. Some of the bonuses got cut. Some of the other benefits got cut. And again, some of these meetings ended up not happening after we raised the flag. And then they had this executive session. And in this executive session, what we learned from our sources was that they brought up two things that there is no way they should be discussing in an executive session. They claimed that this was all under the guise of attorney-client discussions that they couldn't have in the public. But what it turned out was that one of the commissioners, the chair, I believe, she said, let's talk about getting rid of the bylaw committee. And she talked about, do we really have to announce that we're giving bonuses or getting bonuses? And they asked this to the attorney for the district. And that made it attorney-client privilege. But what's interesting here, and this is how we sort of got this, was when we did the initial coverage, one of the commissioners that we heavily criticized in the whole group, for taking these bonuses, she flipped and decided that our coverage was of strong merit. And she approached us and said, after we got word from some sources, and said, I'll talk to you about this. And she was so outraged by what happened, she said, I'll even file a notarized statement. I can't show up at a meeting, because we filed a complaint about this. We were like, this is crazy. Once we found out about it, we said we have to file a complaint. They'd had training. Clearly it wasn't working. And some of the training was very close to when they had this executive session. So clearly, somehow the message wasn't getting across. And it was incredible that we got this cooperation from one of the commissioners. And she gave this testimony, and it played a huge role in the decision that our Freedom of Information Commission ended up making. And the way it works in Connecticut, you have a hearing in front of a hearing officer, and he or she takes in all the information, the testimony. And of course, the Blue Hills Fire District said, I was obsessed with them, and this is why I was doing this, which of course couldn't be further from the truth. We got lots of stories we can do, but this was just so egregious in terms of the executive session and the training that they had already had, that we had to ask for more intervention. And in this case, one of the things you can do in Connecticut after, you do this, testimony in the hearing, is you talk about, well, what kind of penalty would you like? And usually the Freedom of Information Commission, when it meets in full, because the hearing officer makes his or her recommendation, and the full FOIC then has a meeting where they take all the hearings and they make decisions, and they can take whatever recommendation we give for a penalty and then decide what they want to do. And in most cases, they'll just say more training, more training, more training. Okay, that's fine, get it. But these guys had training twice. And in fact, one of the times it was right before this executive session that was highly illegal. And so we said, we want the two commissioners that kept fighting us, because remember, the one cooperated. We want these two commissioners fined to the fullest extent of the law. And technically, it was a sunshine law violation. So it wasn't a keeper of the records situation. And generally with keepers of the records, you can say, okay, he or she didn't give us said document that we had every right to have, or they redacted way more than they should have. And we can ask for a fine of up to $1,000 per person, per keeper of the record, so to speak. But since this was a sunshine law, and for other reasons, again, they usually don't like to bare all their teeth right at once. And they said, let's give these guys yet again more training. So because of us, these guys had training 3 times. We did want the fine, didn't get it. What we talked about in the complaint was they had a very vague description of the meeting, which again, beyond that, one of the bigger problems was this attorney-client privilege that I'd really like to get into a little bit. Certainly in executive session, for valid reasons, you may need to talk to the town attorney, or in this case, the fire district attorney. In this case, that was not true. You were talking about things that need to be discussed in open session. But the reason I bring this up is because there is this troubling trend that I really would like to share with you. I actually ended up dealing with it years earlier in the town of Avon, when there was a police chief, there was no confidence vote. The town did an evaluation of the chief. And then I said, okay, you're done with the evaluation. You've distributed it to council members or whomever. I'd like a copy of that. And they said, absolutely not. And I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, the person who did the evaluation of the chief was an attorney, or he was an investigator for the law firm for the town. And so they cloaked it under attorney-client privilege. And that's exactly what the Blue Hills Fire District was trying to do in this case. They said, well, it's attorney-client privilege. We're talking with our attorney. This is a trend we've started to see in Connecticut, a very troubling one, where towns and agencies will try to say, oh, it's attorney-client privilege, so you can't have it, even though you really should have it. So there was a decision, in fact, just in the last month or so, where New England, or not New England Public Radio, Connecticut Public Radio won against that same police department I was telling you about. And it was regarding a different report about that same chief. And the town used this MO of saying, oh no, it's attorney-client privilege. This time, different FOIC, Freedom of Information Commission members, and they said, oh no, this is illegal. You got to give Connecticut Public Radio that document. And so, of course, I reached out to them after that and said, congratulations. For whatever reason, we couldn't get through when we went to the FOIC on that. And certainly, with that background knowledge, I wanted to hammer home that they're trying to do that here, because this is a troubling trend, I think, as journalists, that I really think we need to stop. I mean, it's one thing if it's legitimate attorney-client privilege, and there are reasons, and we understand that, but to try to cloak it like this when it really wasn't, there was just every attempt at deception and obfuscation here, and that was unacceptable. In the end, like I said, the Freedom of Information Commission said these guys need more training. They got it. They were admonished heavily, though. I don't know if you guys can share the link. I shared it with NEFAC of the actual decision, but they were hammered in that decision in terms of, our complaint was more about the bylaws committee. That, by the way, they ended up abolishing in a later session with almost no discussion, not in an executive session, but in a regular meeting. They abolished this bylaws committee that they talked about in this illegal executive session. And by the way, just as a postscript, they still don't have a bylaws committee because certain commissioners, according to my sources, want to keep sort of being able to do whatever they want. But they were admonished in this FOIC decision for discussing money and bonuses. And it just, honestly, it goes on and on from there. We have continued to cover this commission, but frankly, COVID got in the way, because this was 2016, 2017, 2018, a little bit of 2019. 2020 came along, and we got pulled into COVID like probably many of you did. And we didn't cover it as much because of that. And honestly, we had new management that said, you know what, you've done a lot on this. We'd like to see you do some other stories. And certainly we were doing others, but they didn't like as much of a focus. We did do a story in 2021, though, because as many of you probably have done, you've been working on stories about all these federal programs where money may have been ill-begotten. And in the case of the Blue Hills Fire District, this is another one that frankly was hard for us to believe. The district got over $120,000 in a PPP loan that they then decided to give only a small chunk, but a chunk, bonuses to all the firefighters. And certainly that was done to a degree for first responders and other people who had to go to work during the pandemic, during the scariest days. But the wrinkle here is that the commissioner, I believe she was the chair, because it keeps changing who's the chair and who's not, but one of the commissioners advocated for this, and her husband happens to be a firefighter who got this bonus. And we did a story on it, of course, got brought up in a meeting, and she literally said on camera, this isn't a bonus, this is just extra pay. And so problems persist in this department. We are still monitoring it. It is my understanding that federal authorities have been notified about this situation, and we're certainly ready to cover them again. And we hope that in the future, they're going to be more transparent, although frankly, I'm not sure. And that's about where I'm at. I don't know if you have any questions on this. It's quite a complicated case, but it was one where I feel like we got a little bit of a win here.
Someone asked, did the tip tell you about the executive session being held at the restaurant, or how did you learn about it exactly?
We got a tip after the fact about the executive session at the restaurant. I think I even got a copy of the notice because they're like, yeah, we noticed. And it's like, but that's not the point. I mean, you know, this is why this job is so awesome, Emily, because truth is stranger than fiction. Did you ever think you would be able to tell somebody, oh yeah, I heard about an executive session that was held in a restaurant? I think I still got the paperwork on it. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, I understand you don't know the laws. If you're trying to be a good citizen and contribute and help out your town, okay, but you know, they were told on multiple occasions what they were supposed to do, and they just kept failing. And as a reporter, you have to just keep coming back, and you have to keep working those sources, of which we had many on this story, because certainly when you bring something like this out, people are going to be so outraged that you're going to get more and more sources. But what is strange here is many of the people on this commission that we reported on are still there, and we just monitor. And when we get more tips, we'll be covering them again.
It also shows the importance of tips and having good sources, you know, for sure. And you know, persistence and diligence like you guys have, you know, down there on the.
Well, thanks. There was a lot of nights at meetings, in addition to my day shift. And, you know, you and I were talking about this before we got on here. You know, it's all about being at the meetings. You have to be there. I mean, I know they're long and I know they're boring sometimes. I'm going to one tomorrow night, but I mean, you got to go. It's like, what is it? Woody Allen says 90% of life is just being there. And I think it's true. You know, you got to show up. And that's, I mean, that's where you meet sources, you find sources, you get so much information. But it is crazy when you see meetings run this haywire. And it's just, it was so hard for us to understand. Like, it was like you had training once, you had training again, and you still don't get it. And we did a whole story about your illegal executive session, yet you do another.
Yeah, it's, oh, you know what? We also have another question too from another audience member asking, in Connecticut, is it required for all meetings to be remote now, for public to access remotely?
Oh, no. It would be nice if that was a requirement. Many do it though, which is good. Like the one, it makes it sort of tricky sometimes, because like the one I'm going to tomorrow night is remote. It's remote, but they're going to be there. And I don't know if they have members of the public inside or not. And I can't say too much about why we're going and everything, but so we're going to go and stake out the place a little bit and figure out if we're even allowed in the building. But no, it's not a requirement in Connecticut. It would be good if it was.
This has been really enlightening. And Len, it's always great to hear, you know, how you guys do it, you know, make these stories happen. And, you know, I want to thank you for, you know, showing us, you know, how you got this done.
Well, thank you. And we'll come back anytime. We had a good time talking with you.